Australia's Public Affairs Channel.
Well, I'd just like to welcome you to the arts session on the Australian and its coverage. 1964, well, we couldn't have chosen a better year as far as the arts were concerned to launch itself. The paper would be around to record and campaign during the great censorship brawls of the late 60s and early 70s. Cover the beginnings of the Australia Council, the resurgence of local film, theatre, music and book publishing, and it'd be there when the Opera House opened. And also it would record the sort of growing vitality of the visual arts. And as a result, I think you could say it became a great sponsor of innovative arts writing in Australia. So we're going to look at all that, throw up some memories and anecdotes, I'm sure, and some analysis. Personally, I've had a sort of long and spasmodic association with the paper. These days I write for Fairfax, but I was there at the start and went back in later years as a contributor. I've also had a different kind of connection. My husband, James Hall, had various jobs on the paper. He was one of that procession of editors that Mark referred to. And these days I have a son working on the paper, Lex Hall. So I'd now like to introduce our panellists. It's a great group. Dr. Liz Jeffrey holds a PhD in Media, Music and Cultural Studies, plus an MA Research in Contemporary Music. They're both from Macquarie. She's also an independent arts journalist and commentator, an associate member of the Centre for Media History and Publication Officer for the Australian-New Zealand branch of the International Association for the Study of Popular Music. Sylvia Lawson writes history, critical journalism and fiction. She's worked on newspapers, in academia and in the film industry. Her books include The Archibald Paradox, a study of the early Sydney Bulletin and its first editor, J.F. Archibald. And she's at present film critic for the online and print journal Inside Story. Catherine Brisbane, AM, was co-founder in 1971 with her husband, Dr. Phillip Parsons, of Currency Press, the Performing Arts Publishers, and founder in 2001 of Currency House, a non-profit association established to assert the value of the performing arts in public life. She was a theatre critic for 21 years, notably national critic for The Australian, during a time of great turbulence, radical change, and she's written widely on the history of Australian theatre. She's received many publishing awards, including the A.A. Phillips Award and the National Book Council Award, and holds 2 honorary doctorates from the Universities of New South Wales and WA. Most recently, she's the recipient of the J.C. Williamson Award for Lifetime Achievement. Ashley Wilson has been arts editor of The Australian since 2011. He's been at The Australian for 14 years, working in The Australian's Brisbane bureau for several years before moving north to become the paper's Darwin correspondent. He spent just under 4 years in the Northern Territory, another turbulent period that spanned the Peter Falconio murder trial, the fall of Labor's first Northern Territory Chief Minister, and the Howard government's intervention in remote Aboriginal communities. During that time, he also won a Walkley for reports on unethical behaviour in the Aboriginal art industry, a series that led to a Senate inquiry into the Aboriginal art industry. On his return to Sydney, he was appointed Deputy Arts Editor and then Arts Editor. In 2013, he signed a contract with Text to write a biography of Brett Whiteley. So here we have them. So first up, I'd like to ask Liz to deliver her paper, and we go on from there.
We'll kick off. First of all, thanks very much for being here. Thank you to the Centre for Media History for putting this together and having some faith in a bit of an academic overview before we get into the nuts and bolts of the trenches. And I feel a bit of a fraud, but hopefully that I can add something to this great event. So today, Australian audiences can watch, listen and engage with the arts from almost anywhere. Only a century ago, things were very different. Audiences wanting to access art beyond what they could perform themselves often had to travel a significant distance, and those of professional quality or with contact with international trends could be prohibitively expensive. This restriction had a big impact on how Australians considered their relationship to each other and to the rest of the world. Non-Indigenous Australians, those of us not used to being part of a small population spread across large distances, have often felt a sense of isolation from art scenes, developments and forms. Henry Lawson talked about such isolation in 1895, where he described feelings of being part of the lonely bush. And I think it's important that art had this sense of isolation held within it. It was a term that would resonate with leaders for decades, and with the media as it formed. The media was seen as something of a cure for this. While there are many examples of these battles with the tyranny of distance, as Geoffrey Blainley famously put it, one that comes to mind for me is a speech given by Earl Page in the early days of radio. As part of his opening speech for the Wireless and Electrical Exhibition in Sydney in 1923, a speech that was probably made not far from here actually, he launched the then new medium in terms of its potential to unite the country and share its artistic interests in particular, where he said, "The word lonely will be eliminated from Australian life, with the wireless able to promote the music, song and story of our city and spread it to the most remote of country homes." Flash forward 40 odd years to 1964 and broadcasting was bringing arts to many Australians. We could hear music, poetry and performance via radio's theatre of the mind, while a new form, radio with pictures, was developing its empire in its first decade of transmission. The idea of spreading arts across the country, sharing music, a song, a story, as well as theatre, books, film, television and other arts as they developed, is one that was surely in the minds of the founders of the Australian 50 years ago. As the publication described in its early prospectus or catalogue, I'm not sure what you call it, it was a publication they put out just before it came out, they previewed what they called the lively arts and its coverage, and if you'll forgive me I'll just read you a little bit of that. The editors proclaimed, "The lively arts and lively artists are news, and news will be the Australian. From its dress circle seat in the national capital, the Australian will furnish its readers with a comprehensive view of trends and events in music, ballet, opera, drama, painting, sculpture, films and television. Critics and reporters in Canberra and all state capitals will survey the Australian artistic scene. Overseas developments will be reviewed by staff writers of the Australian and newspapers with which it is associated in London and New York. The Australian will introduce its readers to the people whose job it is to entertain and inform the world. The singer arriving for a tour of this country, the actress who has captivated New York, the TV personality at the top of the ratings. If a fiddler plays a wrong note in Boston or Bristol, the Australian will know about it. If he does it twice, the Australian will tell its readers." So to move forward, to the specifics of starting a national arts conversation in the Australian, and I think that was the really important thing, a national arts conversation that was happening daily. So putting together a national daily piece, a daily place for written arts coverage and criticism was surely an interesting proposition. The ABC was developing its coverage across the country on radio and television, and national commercial network chains were developing during this time too. But the building of a centralised print outlet across the country was the claiming of an interesting piece of real estate. I imagine that at once this was an advantage and a disadvantage for national art scenes and coverage. Would a national scene be developed that would allow arts to diversify across cities, or to tour the country and build audience support? Or would centralised arts coverage lead to a homogenisation of an existing scene, as the quirks of regional identity and context were ironed out or overlooked in the place of the more professional, cutting-edge or impressive work of major publications with major money in major cities? Perhaps both of these things happened and are continuing to happen, and perhaps that's fine, I'm not sure. If it's okay, I'd like to drill down a little to look at what a couple of national print arts places did provide, a space for national arts critics. The role of an arts critic is one that academics and other commentators have often argued, and it's also one that artists and audiences have often debated in terms of its value. Oscar Wilde famously explored the role of the critic as artist, from his position as both a critic and an artist. And the role of arts commentary, criticism and dialogue has been explored by various theorists, least of all Roland Barthes' famous idea of the death of the author and the birth of the reader, encouraging a dialogue and engagement with the arts. Not just placing the author as the sole place of meaning, but drawing an audience out. In terms of the specifics of the Australian when it started, I decided to go back to the first month of the paper, looking at the arts as they appeared in their first pages. Reading it back now, I found some interesting things. Firstly, if arts journalists, like all journalists, are those who write the first rough drafts of history, it was fascinating to look at the types of scenes that were getting their first drafts here at the time. And I think yesterday there was talk about whether or not editors were looking to the horizon or just to the next step. And it must have just been to the next step. But to find what they found and to cover what they found, I still find is really remarkable. Firstly, as was in the preview that I put out for this, I'd expected in 1964 that there might be something to say about the presence or absence of one of the biggest arts movements of the day, the Beatles and their tour to Australia around the time of the Oz's launch. Indeed, there were traces of the Fabs in those early pages, however no talk about their music. They were put within a gossip context. Now that's interesting. I mean, you know, the Beatles have become bigger than their music in lots of ways. Really interesting that at the time that's how they would be represented. It was in Peter Brennan's page, I think it was labelled The Lighter Side, the page 3 that ran on for a while. There was also, within that first month, a reference later on to the Beatles possibly being listed on the stock exchange. I mean, look at where they've become now, Beatles empire. Again, to pull that out in 1964, how fascinating. Now, this still leaves a hole in a question. Was the music not a key part of the story at the time, but rather was it just the band's fame? Maybe there just wasn't time to get a hold of the records. Maybe there was a feeling that they were already being covered somewhere else. I'm not sure. That's what we get to ask. Pulling on the music thread, and you might have picked that the music thread is my thread. Reading through what the Oz was covering in terms of music, I found some really interesting things, but also some stuff that is of particular importance to a modern reader, to a modern music person. Interestingly, there was a dedicated folk music presence by Edgar Waters, who named himself from I think it was the first weekend edition, as the folk music reporter. Now, as far as I know, there wasn't a lot of folk music reporting, dedicated folk music reporting going on at the time, even though now when we go back and have a look, folk, of course, was something that was bubbling away. But it would be easy to think from our, memories of the 60s or our assumptions of the 60s that it was all boys and rock and roll. Very interesting. Now, this was at a time when broadcast media was besotted with pop, rock and classical, and pop and rock were particularly tied to television as it was developing and growing. So this was perhaps a form that could have easily fallen on the wayside, and it's thanks to Edgar's work now that I can go back as a researcher and have names to look up. If you don't know who you're looking for, you can't find them, even as wonderful as our access is now. Without his first draft of history, I don't have somewhere to go back and look, so thanks Edgar, wherever you are. The coverage of folk in these early issues has lots to tell a contemporary reader, researcher and music fan. First, the new folk and roots revival has a strong precedent here, and it's also in these early pages where he started to raise the question of a local sound, identity and a place in the international context. So Edgar ran a piece titled "Australians Couldn't Match Dylan," where he talked about a particular Australian artist who he said is not angry enough. Is this an Australian characteristic? I'm not sure. I think Australians can be angry anyway. Thanks, Edgar. The national paper also raised some interesting questions. What was the role of the ABC in covering this new genre of music? And what were the consequences for ignoring it at the time? It allowed room for discussion not just with the broader logistics of this, but also invited audiences to engage. So one of the very early letters to the editor, sparked by Edgar and his work, asked the question, why do artists stay here? What is there for us here? Do we need to go overseas in order to make our art? A question that is still pertinent 50 years on. Folk in this instance also too seemed to be positioned somewhere beyond the national popular music industry as a commercial space. It was looking for arts as a national identity, as something that could transcend regionality, which makes sense with the vision of a national paper. This type of coverage was just a tiny pocket of the arts, of the Oz arts. There were many other types, as the rest of the panel will demonstrate. But even this little piece, this little fragment that's been left, provides what otherwise could be lost, and what could provide a lot more context for contemporary artists. It's not just Mumford and Sons and Boy and Bear and the other Paul Kelly that's been doing this stuff. This has been going around for a long time. What was the reason for this focus on folk? Was it Edgar's personal interest? Was it an editorial decision? An opportunity to fill a gap in the market? Certainly it was a field that broadcast wasn't taking seriously or systematically. Having a little look around, I noticed the Canberra Times had a bit of folk coverage, so perhaps what Mark was mentioning about the competition with Canberra was maybe why they pulled it out. I'm not sure. Arts journalism and commentary covering stage, screen, music and other performance types is not just about gatekeeping, although I think sometimes it's easy to think that it is. It's about providing access points and energy transfer opportunities. It's about providing something for the lonely bush to play on the Beatles theme. Perhaps it's about giving Eleanor Rigby some friends, I'm not sure. But today, in an increasingly crowded review environment where online recommendations, blogs and likes are everywhere, I find it even more interesting to look at the idea of dedicated print arts coverage in a centralised space. Edgar's work's still giving me something to look for. If I didn't know the names of those artists, I couldn't find them on Google. Google won't just tell me. So, thanks for letting me keep going.
Well, I think we'll just roll on and then we can have questions on everybody's papers at the end. So, Sylvia?
Thank you, Sandra. I haven't got a paper. And the reasons I haven't, and the reason for the title you've got there, sitting there, Breakthrough in '64, is that when Bridget kindly first invited my participation, I didn't know I'd have to be in Canberra struggling for the life of the National Film and Sound Archive, which is where I've been. I've done very modest amounts in that direction, but even so, that's actually relevant to what I'm going to talk about in this briefly discussing reviewing films. I'm very grateful to the Australian as it once was in the late 60s and early 70s. I had been reviewing films from a position of enthusiasm but profound ignorance in the earlier 60s for Nation, and a flag should be waved in tribute to a late and great editor, Tom Fitzgerald, who, like all the rest of us, gravitated to the Australian and to Rupert at one time. But I had great freedom there and for a limited audience. Going to the Australian in, I think, '69, expanded the audience, and having a sense of an expanded audience gives the writer an absolutely essential confidence. You've got to feel that you're talking to people, more people if possible, and that's pretty terrific. And that was pretty important in what's actually, I find, a lifelong business of learning to write about cinema. Cinema was not a word we used in those days. We talked about film, we talked about the movies, but the notion of cinema as an extraordinary, compendious range of forms going back, well, to 1895, that's right, involving soundtracks, music tracks, eventually voice tracks, narrative tracks, and very importantly in documentary and film essay argument tracks that I and most others in the English-speaking world didn't know a whole lot about. But through the work of Nation, which preceded my time on the Australian, I did form the erroneous and romantic view, still clung to slightly, that cinema was really French by definition. Of course, I was totally wrong. And what I want to say is that I shared the reviewing in the Australian intermittently with the filmmaker Mike Thornhill, and he was part of a group for whom the classical years of Hollywood were everything, and my addiction to the continental European was totally wrong-headed. Anyhow, all these debates were extremely healthy, and they found partial voices through the arts pages of the Australian. And another tribute to the late James Hall. He was a terrific section editor, he really was. He'd let you do just about anything. In my case, that included not only film reviewing, but starting a column on magazines, because I got fascinated on the side with the way magazines, Meange and Southerly, Quadrant, all those, and others around, were arguing with each other, failing to engage, crossing voices. So, as film critic, I also ran a magazine column for a while. That was fun. And one other thing I'll always remember that he very cheerfully let me do was write a reply. And this would have been in 71, I think. It was during the period of the McMahon government. He allowed me to write a reply at some length to a very nasty review of Germaine Greer's Female Eunuch. Of course, I wrote a pro-feminist reply, which was needed, I think, at the time. But anyhow, that's a quick and personal, very long-distance example of the free-ranging view Jim Hall had of what the arts pages and their regular contributors could do. But when it came to film, I just had to learn a lot from the debates I've mentioned between the pro-classical Hollywood people, or even less classical Hollywood, and the those who were, like me, addicted to European cinema, but to do so in full expectation that we had an audience who would respond, who were happy for us to go left and right in all directions out of field and invite us to look at films if we could find them, which was another matter too, to complain in fact about film circulation, to pick up on the then shaky enterprises of the film festivals, and to cop, as I did, hostility from Melbourne, because Melbourne knew, and still does know, that it is of course the cinematic capital of Australia. No, sorry, the Southern Hemisphere. and the nature of those debates and arguments with Melbourne are sort of another story. But the point is that the Australian was national. What you said in the Australian would reach Melbourne and reach all the others, and that that really mattered when you're involved yourself as much as a student as any kind of teacher or critic in seeking to expand the range of people's expectations of cinema. And as I was expanding my own expectations, so I hope I expanded those of others. What I've said so far will show you that I can't quite accept any watertight division between the Australian in the media landscape and the Australian in the arts landscape. The arts are not, never have been, never will be watertight. They are not to be disengaged from politics. And another story I do know quite a lot about, which Sandra referred to, the story of the Sydney Opera House. If you want an example of how you cannot keep art shielded from politics, there's one. Then from 1957 until now. But I want to confess some deficiencies in that film reviewing of a long time back. First saying, I think I wrote better for the reasons already given, the sense of confidence and freedom. But I also was, perhaps forgivably, perhaps not, immune to the pull and challenge of documentary. We always had documentary films being made here, for better and for worse. And the standard attitude among young film Turks of whatever stripe was that you regarded what used to be the Commonwealth Film Unit as dreary, dust-covered, bound by bureaucracy and all the rest of it. This was profoundly unfair, and it's taken me the decades from then till now, really, and some work on history to understand how wrong it was. We were also extraordinarily deaf and blind to the claims of Asian cinema, even though quite a lot of Indian cinema and indeed some Chinese of both sides of the border did come in with film festivals. I think there's still a level of unconsciousness of the wealth of Asian cinema. There were, in other words, heaps and heaps of things we didn't know. But I have to be brief for reasons given. But skipping from then till now, I think that it's always true that a reviewer or critic of film is writing in a context, in a total political, social context, of course, but also in their own media context. Thank you, Peter Brown. I cannot ever say enough for independent critical journalism, without which we would be dead in different ways. But when you're writing for newspapers with some reach, and Sandra knows far more about this now than I do, but you are in that context. People still haven't much choice of proprietors. If their role and their mode is the newspaper, online or in print. And therefore I can't agree with those who today say, how can they write for the Australian? Because, as we all know, the Australian has changed enormously. Its politics has changed, and we've heard from Mark something about the transitions that proprietor, who is just, well, he's the Napoleon of our times, isn't he? Extraordinarily powerful. If the job you've got is writing within the Murdoch press, then that is the job you've got. And it's terrific, really, how people still writing cultural critical work in that context do their jobs and manage to communicate critical issues. And it seems to me they still do so. And I don't know, for his own reasons, Rupert doesn't seem to mind. Arts criticism is there, arts criticism has its place. There they are. But I'll just say one more thing about that. I don't think anyone can or should be holier than thou in relation to journalists who find their places in that media as much as in the more liberal or left liberal media. They're all shrinking, they're all changing. Newspapers, we're told, will be gone in 5 years, will they? I don't know. I don't actually think so. But I have to throw something to Mark with gratitude for his terrific lecture, and it's got nothing to do with film or something sometimes. In Alice Springs, which is a place I go to quite often, with the Centralian advocate, they look at it and they say, do you think he knows he owns it? Anyway, I'll leave film there. I'm very happy to talk further on the reviewing film business, which has gone through many permutations in my checkered career. But anyway, it's a great job to be doing. I love it.
Fellow film reviewer, there's lots I want to ask you about there, but we'll go on. So Catherine's up next.
Well, I joined the Australian in 1967, and I was the second theatre critic appointed. The first one was Francis Evers, about who I'll say something in a minute. I was reasonably well qualified for the job. I'd been working on the West Australian since I did my cadetship there in '54, I think it was, and I went through until we moved to Sydney in '64. So there's 10 years with a 2-year gap, at which I went overseas for 2 years and worked as one did in those days, you know, around Fleet Street as in a clerical job, and went to the theatre every night, and I read many of the great critics of the time, like Kenneth Tynan and Harold Hobson and Penelope Gilliard and all. And I had been doing reviews, little reviews at the West Australian, and I came back and made a bit more on the West Australian, sorry. And I built this up, and when we moved to Sydney, I had my eye on becoming the theatre reviewer of the Sydney Morning Herald. That was then Roger Cavell, who's doing both drama and music, and in due course he decided to give up the drama, and I'd been a stringer for him at that stage. However, I had a call from John Douglas Pringle, whom you remember as the grand editor of the Herald at the time. He said to me that thank you for